In the spring of 1972, deep in the chaos of the Vietnam War, one bridge was all that stood between the North Vietnamese Army and total victory in the south. This is the story of a man who stopped an entire army, not with a rifle, not with a tank, but with his bare hands, a bag of explosives, and a sheer refusal to give in. By March of 1972, many back home in the USA believed the Vietnam War was winding down, at least for US forces. Back home, public opinion had largely turned against the war, with most Americans no longer believing in the idea of victory and instead wanting the conflict to simply be over. The government had been steadily withdrawing troops and was in the process of handing things over to the South Vietnamese, while peace negotiations between all three parties were already underway in Paris. But on the ground, it was quite a different story. In April, the North Vietnamese launched a sudden, brutal offensive, which would become known as the Easter Offensive across the demilitarized zone. Their tanks and infantry swept south under a curtain of artillery, aiming to drive deep into South Vietnam and force a final collapse before those peace negotiations could be finalized. At the center of their plan was one critical crossing, the Dong Ha Bridge. The Dong Ha Bridge linked the northern and southern banks of the Cua Viet River. If the North could take it, they'd be able to roll tanks and troops deep into the country's fragile heart. If they couldn't, their advance would grind to an abrupt halt. At Dong Ha, a handful of US advisors and South Vietnamese defenders had been strategizing on how to best defend the bridge once the enemy arrived, and among them was Captain John Ripley, a lean, tough, and quietly stubborn career Marine. When it became clear the enemy was moving faster than anticipated and that their arrival at Dong Ha was imminent, in lieu of a robust plan for defending the bridge and for fear they might fail, Ripley was given a simple order: blow the thing to hell. There was just one problem. The bridge wasn't prepped for demolition. No explosives had been rigged, and the enemy was expected to arrive within hours. And they were already prepping artillery batteries easily within firing distance of Dong Ha. Ripley didn't flinch. With a small team and the help of a fellow South Vietnamese Marine, Captain Le Ba Bin, they gathered every demolition charge they could find, packed them into canvas bags, and sprinted to the bridge. It was broad daylight, and as they approached the bridge, the sky erupted. Artillery shells began landing on both banks, shaking the ground and sending up plumes of smoke and debris. There was no more time. If they waited, they'd be cut off at best, or at worst, the bridge would be taken intact, clearing the way for an easy procession south for the enemy. The only way to place the charges was by climbing out beneath the bridge itself, a steel latticework stretching across open air. So that's precisely what Ripley did. Hand over hand, the captain crawled out along the side of the bridge, legs braced against the beams, with his body dangling in full view. He worked in silence. He was deliberate. He was careful. He placed one charge after another, inching along the beams, exposed and alone. Above him, the artillery fire grew heavier. Shockwaves from the blast rocked the bridge itself, shaking the steel beneath his hands, and at times, the bridge seemed to sway and bow. Shrapnel hissed through the air, and chunks of concrete and steel rained down around him, crashing onto the banks of the river and splashing into the water beneath him. At one point, Ripley was nearly thrown loose by the concussive force of a nearby shell. He clung on with burning arms, his uniform soaked with sweat and river mist. But still, he kept going. For nearly 3 hours, Ripley worked beneath the span of the Dong Ha Bridge, rigging each beam by hand, all while enemy tanks closed the distance. By the time he wired that final charge, NVA scouts had already reached the far bank. The first tanks were less than 2 kilometers away, and they were closing in fast. There was no time to double-check the setup, no room for mistakes. Ripley scrambled back across the beams, detonator in hand, just as fresh artillery rounds began striking the bridge itself. There was no dramatic speech and no poetic moment to reflect on the situation. Just one Marine, soaked with sweat and stained with dirt, staring out at a river bridge and willing it to vanish. And then, boom. In an instant, the span crumpled. collapsing into the river in a roar of smoke and falling steel. The North Vietnamese assault stalled. Their spearhead stopped cold at the river's edge. For days, they searched desperately for another way forward, but by then, the moment was lost. The destruction of Dong Ha Bridge denied the North a swift breakthrough. It slowed the enemy, broke their momentum, but more than that, it bought the Americans and the South Vietnamese critical time. Time that allowed them to regroup. Thousands of South Vietnamese soldiers and civilians were able to move further south. Lives that may well have been lost were it not for the work of John Ripley. It also brought precious days for the defenders of Quang Tri, a key city and strategic stronghold just beyond the river, time that may well have changed the course of the entire campaign. John Ripley was awarded the Navy Cross for his gallantry at Dong Ha. He'd go on to serve for another 2 decades, eventually rising to the rank of colonel, and unsurprisingly, his actions at Dong Ha became the stuff of legend, although he never quite saw them that way. To him, it had simply been a job that needed to be done. As he once said himself, "I had no choice. You either do it or you don't do it." And on that long, lonely bridge, with the future of millions hanging in the balance, John Ripley did it. And with that single act, the tide of the battle shifted, and a North Vietnamese victory, at least for a time, was stopped cold at the river's edge. For more epic tales from the War Stories archive, hit that subscribe button to enlist today. Then, pick one of the stories on screen to select your next mission. Over and out, soldier.